So we were keen to scale this up and try and propose a solution to global water shortages. And if we were to scale this up to a really large extent and evaporate huge quantities of seawater, then ideally we wouldn't want to have to pump that. So we've identified various places around the world that are on land but below sea level. If we could get a sea pipe to some of these, then we could bring in unlimited quantities of seawater just under gravity. And the other advantage of coming inland is the air is much drier. So we could evaporate 3 times as much seawater and create that much more fresh water. So now, when we think about nature, we often think it's all about competition. But actually, if you look at mature ecosystems, you're just as likely to find remarkable examples of symbiotic relationships, organisms that have evolved to hook up for mutual benefit. So we applied this basic principle of biomimicry to our scheme by looking for other technologies that would be synergistic with the seawater greenhouse. And we settled on concentrated solar power as the ideal candidate, CSP. This works by focusing the sun's heat to create steam to drive turbines, and it's twice as efficient as conventional photovoltaics. And the key synergies between these two are firstly that they both work very well in hot, sunny desert locations. CSP needs a supply of demineralized water to keep the mirrors clean, and that's exactly what the seawater greenhouse produces. CSP also produces a huge amount of waste heat. We could make use of all that to evaporate more seawater and create more fresh water. So this shows all the main elements of the scheme: the sea, connected with a sea pipe, 3 strips of greenhouse, growing crops within and between the greenhouses, and the solar power plants. So it's a model for how we could create zero-carbon food, renewable energy, and abundant fresh water in some of the most water-stressed parts of the planet. It has a payback period of between 6 and 12 years, and from then on, the energy, water, and carbon sequestration would be virtually free. Innovation based on a beetle to achieve huge cuts in carbon at low cost. So I'd like to draw together 1 or 2 conclusions now about biomimicry. It's already had a huge influence in other fields, and I firmly believe it can do the same for the construction industry. And in a recession, what better form of innovation than one that can create more value out of less resources, that can turn waste into an opportunity, and that can address multiple challenges simultaneously. And we could do the same for office buildings. We could use biomimicry to find ways of cooling buildings in new ways, creating buildings that use a fraction of the structural material, buildings that conduct daylight down to where it's required very ingeniously. There's a whole world of possibilities open to those clients who want to create the buildings that will command the highest rent in 5 years' time. In the second half of my talk, I want to address some of Bjorn's points more specifically. Over the last few weeks, I've read quite a lot of material written by skeptics. And in some respects, it does seem to be quite easy to be a skeptic. I'll tell you what I mean. Here's one example. This is a chart of global temperature changes, and you can see it's mostly red, getting hotter. However, there are 1 or 2 blue dots. So it'd be fairly easy to focus a lot of attention on those parts of the world that are getting colder. You can even find 1 or 2 glaciers that are growing. Of course, there are loads that are getting much smaller, but of course you could always ignore those. And then if you take sea level rises, you could select some short intervals when sea levels could appear to be going down. And between 2007 and 2008, that appears to have occurred, which might sound significant if you state it in text, but it doesn't look all that convincing if you see it on a graph. Now, all these things help to create confusion and doubt about climate change and about the seriousness of climate change. Then, turning to natural resources, if you look at total global fish catch, you can see that it's gone steadily upwards. And it'd be very easy to persuade people that actually the oceans are doing just fine. But that is actually confusing flow with stocks, and they're not the same thing, just as income is not the same as capital. So if a managing director is paying himself a huge monthly salary, it doesn't necessarily mean the company is doing well. And the same applies to the oceans. Another thing you could do is you could compare the cost of one adaptive measure, like saving polar bears, with a cost for doing the whole of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, of course, if you were to include all the impacts of climate change, so not just one species, but potentially millions, and then add in floods, droughts, hurricanes, sea level rise, etc., then I think you find that bar chart would look a bit different. But if you're a skeptic, you ignore that. Well, some of you may already have guessed this. These aren't just random examples. These are all examples of the kinds of distortions that Bjorn has used. And I think we are entitled to ask whether this represents a balanced approach. There's someone called Frank Ackerman who's assessed the degree of balance in Bjorn's book Cool It by analyzing the different sources that he uses. He's compared the number of references to, on here, the left-hand side, well-known climate skeptics, and on the right-hand side, well-known climate scientists. So let's have a look at how they've scored. 4, 2, 4, 11 for the hurricane skeptic. Now let's have a look at the right-hand side. Oh, my word, it's nil point for the right-hand side. Now, I'd like to say a few words about the Copenhagen consensus, which Bjorn alluded to there. And Bjorn's argument could be summarized as follows. We've only got a limited amount to spend. Climate change is far from urgent, and tackling it will be very expensive while doing little good. While it seems reasonable on first inspection, I believe there are some serious flaws with this argument. So let's start with the first one. The UK is fairly typical for developed nations. We give about 0.3% of our GNP in foreign aid. And Bjorn implies that if we spend money on climate change, it means that there'll be less available for foreign aid. But actually, it is how we manage our carbon emissions in the other 99.7% of our GNP that's significant. And it's not necessarily about cutting things. It's about doing things differently. So the next one is that climate change is not an urgent issue. Well, Bjorn quotes the IPCC figure of 18 to 59 centimeters, but what the report actually predicted was a sea level rise of 18 to 59 centimeters plus an unknown extra rise from various other factors. It's surprising that Bjorn ignores that, but I guess it is rather inconvenient. Well, the scientists met again earlier this year, and they concluded that sea levels are actually likely to rise by a meter over the coming century unless very urgent action is taken. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Greenland ice shelf is breaking up far faster than originally predicted. And if that happens, we'd see sea level rises of 6 meters. Here's another example. Roughly 40% of humanity depends on the Himalayan watershed for summer meltwater for their agriculture. With unabated climate change, many of those could be lost by 2050. And with that, the sustenance for hundreds of millions of people. Try telling them that climate change is not an urgent issue.